So, what is Elden Ring? It can safely be considered a Dark Souls 4 of sorts, much like Dark Souls could be considered Demon Souls 2. The MP change feels like a way to unshackle the design and development of the game from its predecessors rather than a reflection of the desire of making something wholly unique. Elden Ring uses Dark Souls 3 as a base, thus it controls the same. Most of the animations are either ported from that game or have been slightly remade. Those that have been left untouched feel slightly better because of the more advanced animation blending. Everything's smoother and slicker. But outside of that, it's Dark Souls 3, except in an open world. When it comes to that, the major divergence from industry standards, similarly to Breath of the Wild, is the overall lack of direction given to the player. For years, the Ubisoft formula has been, rightfully, criticized by many people. By Ubisoft formula, I mean opening a map, selecting a point of interest you've unlocked, reaching that location by following a marker, and finally clearing the content there, which is generally very streamlined and modular. This is a very standard open world formula. I believe it works in all honesty, but it gets tiring and repetitive very quickly, and should have been dropped years ago. For many, myself included, it has lost all the appeal it ever had to offer. There are some interesting variations of it though. The Witcher 3, for example, follows it pretty closely, but it seems mostly as an excuse to fill the beautiful map with stuff to do. But other pieces of side content in that game are actually well made and feel purposeful. Only between every meaningful side quest there is pointless checklist tier padding of bandit camps and monster nests. These wouldn't be so bad if the combat and rewards and looting were better, but the game heavily struggles a lot with those two elements. Also the fact there is no exploration involved and you are simply following a marker, much like Ubisoft Worlds, makes everything feel even more artificial and meaningless. So the praise Elden Ring has received for not falling into those same traps is justified. It's an open world that does bring something unique and different to the video game landscape, and it has to be commended for it. It isn't afraid of letting the player feel lost, or of hiding content from him. There is no checklist, very little is actually communicated to you on the map. So huge props to From Software for making a good open world game that rises above the still ocean of mediocrity this stagnant genre has called home. But the game is far from perfect. As I've said before, I was absolutely loving the game at first. The feeling of discovery and exploration are unparalleled. I'll always remember taking the elevator in Mistwood and ending up in Siofra River, or being teleported at a low level to Caelid, an horrific landscape of death and decay, or finding a bridge on the side of Stormvale that allowed me to reach Liurnia earlier, using a gateway and getting a small tease of the capital way before I could actually access it. All of these moments were amazing. In fact, this is probably the best compliment I can give the game, besides the gorgeous aesthetic of the world itself, which are for the most part amazing. I can summarize my highest praise of Elden Ring like this. It's a collection of beautiful, memorable and impactful moments. But let's take a deeper look at exploration. The game gives you very little direction, so you are encouraged to navigate every nook and cranny of the map, uncovering dungeons, ruins, secrets, NPCs, items and whatnot. You have to find this stuff yourself unless you're looking at a wiki. For the amount of content this map has, very little is actually telegraphed beforehand. Even the weird statues pointing at catacombs feel pretty meaningless. Most of the time I'd find the dungeon itself before I'd even see the waypoint. But this is still a Souls game. I've talked before of how important itemization was in those games. Beating a boss or accessing the next area in general was the major goal of any level, but then clearing the place of items, talking to all NPCs and defeating all the enemies were secondary goals. These weren't necessary, but they felt so, because they were rewarding. Playing those games with a completionist mindset ensured that your character was going to be strong and competent, making the combat easier and thus more satisfying, because it felt like you earned the easier difficulty. A game like Sekiro doesn't need that. It has a similar level design philosophy as Dark Souls, but its focus is instead in asking the player of getting better at fighting. Thus, killing everything on your way is the satisfying reward in of itself. In Dark Souls or Bloodborne, confidently and safely traversing an area because you've built a competent character is a major source of satisfaction, for me at least. So, what about Elden Ring? Well, it's the same as Dark Souls again. The formula is the same. Everything about it is largely the same. The character building is the same. You have the same stats as Dark Souls 3 -1. You use XP to level them up, and your XP also acts as currency. You gain and lose XP in the same way. It features the exact same checkpoint and save system as Dark Souls and Sekiro, with the addition of Stakes of Marika. Weapon upgrading works the same. Items work the same. There is now crafting, but we'll get there. Enemies work the same. Most of them are immediately hostile, but with a rather dumb AI, you can sometimes exploit through stealth. They have random loot tables, much like other Souls games. The healing system is the same as Dark Souls 3. Even the blue Estus for mana is carried over. The major difference is that refills are now predictable in how they work and are not random like in DS3. NPCs are the same as Dark Souls. You can exhaust their dialogue options. Some of them may act as vendors, while some others may have a questline that proceeds as you keep encountering them. Besides that, they are pretty static. Some NPCs might dynamically help you fight enemies during certain scripted events, but that's it. Bosses work the same, but now some of them freely roam the map. The combat is the same, and it's the focus of the experience, the main way the player interacts with the environment. Sure, the weapon arts system has been greatly expanded, but it doesn't shake up the formula in a meaningful way. In short, everything is mostly the same. Elden Ring's open world has major flaws that become more noticeable as you keep playing. I was loving the open world at first, while exploring Limgrave and Shofra River. Then I went on to do Caelid and Liurnia in a scattered order, and it was during these sessions that I started to realize something. I wasn't having fun anymore. Now I finished it, and I can say the following pretty confidently. Elden Ring is a 100 hours game, but offers only 30, maybe 40 hours of fun. Don't get me wrong, it's still more fun than most video games out there. But is it really worth it? In any case, I will explain why I don't think the game is fun. I believe a lot of it can be tracked down to a central problem, which is what I was just talking about. Elden Ring is Dark Souls 4 for all intents and purposes. It's a game that takes the Dark Souls formula and gameplay, with minimal alterations, and plops it into an open world. I think this didn't work out as well as From Software hoped. A lot of the enjoyment of Dark Souls games came from their level design, the feeling of clearing and traversing an hostile environment, using your tools and wits, with some degree of trial and error that works off the tension induced by the hostility. Being set in an open world with easy accessible fast travel, Elden Ring mostly lost this element. This alone removes a lot of the fun that made the formula great, but the latter hasn't been changed enough, or at all even, to compensate for it. Elden Ring, theoretically, still offers you some of that classic Dark Souls experience in its legacy dungeons, or even the lesser dungeons. But for now I want to keep talking about the open world. Due to what I've said about itemization and level design, I think Souls games are inherently a power fantasy. Every successful interaction with the world around you will potentially make your character more competent and powerful. To me, that was the driving satisfaction of those games. So now we have Elden Ring, which changes nothing about the formula, or the way the game controls, or how it feels to play. But it's an open world now, so in order to gain the same satisfaction as Dark Souls, I'd need to explore the entirety of the map, just like how in Dark Souls I cleared all the levels. And you may already start to see the problems. In a way, the lack of direction is both Elden Ring's greatest strength as an open world, and maybe even its biggest weakness. Elden Ring, by playing and feeling like Dark Souls, encourages players to approach things the same way. That means clearing most of the content, for people like me at least. So if the game isn't going to advertise its content, I will comb the entire map looking for it, because if I miss something important, I'm afraid my character won't be as powerful as I want it to be, or I could miss something that would be perfect for my build or roleplay. And for the first few hours, combing the map was satisfying. I liked finding every dungeon, every ruin, every encampment, and so on. But ultimately this mindset and playstyle made the game a chore to play past the first 15 or 20 hours. So if you still haven't played Elden Ring, don't do it that way I did. But is it the player's fault for playing the game wrong? Or the game's for not featuring a world design better tuned to its gameplay? What elements make exploring feel like a chore? First of all, the geography. I can commend From Software for making an open world where you actually need to think how to traverse due to how vertical it is. What I think they did wrong, though, was the positioning of the many points of interest in the map. It's one thing to have impossible cliffs and hills to encourage careful navigation. It's another to perpetually force players to scan the edges of the map, or every change in elevation to look for a dungeon entrance, or a beetle with an ash of war, or a village with living jars in it, and so on. This is just stupid world design, and it's going to give you a migraine if you're trying to find all the side content and get all the major rewards in the open world. The map is huge, like really big. There is already plenty of space on the horizontal axis. If the elevation was to be normalized, it will still take a long time to ride around it all with torrent. So a good open world design would have utilized all this horizontal space for its side content. This way you'd stumble organically upon it as you move from a visible point of interest to the next. See that mountain over there? You can climb it. Only on its way you'll find a dungeon, a ruined fort or a soldier camp. The game does this sometimes, but there are way too many points of interest just tucked away in the sides of cliffs or on the edge of the map. As a player, you'll be conditioned very early on by this design choice. Your brain will pick up on it and you'll start to scan the environment more like a schizo rather than an adventurer. Now, this issue is that it's worse in Limgrave, Liurnia and Caelid. Altus Plateau, including Mount Gelmir, and the mountaintops of the Giant, including the Snowfield, can be cleared 100% in a far more relaxed and organic way. The Snowfield does have most of its point of interest off to the sides, but there aren't many of them, and it's literally just a big empty circle, so it's not as aggravating. The underground areas you can explore with Torrent are also really good and are probably my favorite open world areas in the game. But I guess we can move on to our next issue. The problem at hand is the sheer density of stuff to do. The map is very big, full of things to find and explore. There is a lot of side content. Issue is, it isn't varied or worthy of your attention enough to warrant all this quantity. Outside of legacy dungeons, you'll come across a few types of areas in the lands between. For example, there are the catacombs, which all share the same tilesets and lighting. They also generally feature the same enemy types, mainly imps and skeletons. You may find a few more interesting ones in terms of enemies, layout and gameplay gimmicks, but the vast majority of them are very samey. You go in, you find the lever and you unlock the boss. I don't hate these, in fact the more unique ones, like Warded Catacomb or the Auriza's Side Tomb, were some of my favorite parts of the game. But the feeling of doing the same thing over and over is definitely there if you clear all the catacombs in the game. Mines are slightly more varied. You have normal ones, crystal ones, a frozen one, and I think there are a couple more individual variations. Still, most of these tend to have a very boring and samey layout. In fact, almost all of them share the identical elevator shaft, with the same platforms you can jump on. Enemy types are repeated often here as well. Caves probably feature the most variety, but much like catacombs and mines, they still follow the same repetitive format. You go in, you have a boss at the end, and you teleport out once you're done. These three are the major side content in the game, and they are going to feel extremely samey very quickly. Why not have more dungeons with no boss at the end? Why not have more dungeons that connect to each other, or that have an actual exit as opposed to a teleport? Why not condense the more interesting gameplay ideas into a smaller overall number of dungeons across the world, instead of finding a unique one every 5 ones that feel the same as the others? Another type of dungeon are the hero graves. There aren't many of them, and these do feel pretty unique. The chariot ones go for a trial and error type experience. It can definitely feel frustrating and almost trollish at times, but I can at least appreciate the intent and the level design ideas that went into them. I like them, but once again I have to complain that they are all formatted the same, with a boss at the end and a teleport. Moving on to the surface world, one of the most common points of interest is ruins. These are particularly egregious since they are literally copy and pasted everywhere. They basically all share the same layout, and most of them have the same hole in the floor that leads you to a basement, where you'll usually find either a chest, a boss fight, or both. They are probably the overall worst pieces of content. The first one you find in front of Stormegg Gate is the most interesting one because it blends the concept with that of enemy camps. Enemy camps are extremely bland since it's just a bunch of enemies guarding a reward. There is no mechanical difference between them and random enemy encounters in the open world. Using stealths to clear these would have been a neat idea, but I only ever had to do that again in the Stormgate one. The Omen camp in Altus as well, because I don't like fighting Omens. Then you have a couple of puzzle types, mage towers and paintings. They are either fine or mediocre for the most part, with a few infuriating exceptions, like Kelowna's Rise. There are a few villages, 2 of which feature frenzied enemies. Much like camps, these are just congregations of mobs you can whack. There is one with dancing women, that was cool I guess. There are churches of America, they all look the same and most will yield you a flask upgrade. Minor erdtrees usually allow you to fight a boss, the boss, which is Asylum Demon again. There is one where you fight a worm face though, so I guess that's something. Then there are various forts which aren't proper legacy dungeons, like Fort Height. You go in, you defeat all the enemies and get a couple of rewards. Stealth is rarely viable, let alone needed. Riveting. I'd say a really big issue with all of this side stuff is the fact that Elden Ring is just a combat game. That's all you do from beginning to end. There is some platforming and some traps you have to avoid, but most of the time you're fighting the same enemies in the same rooms, halls and ruins over and over. And yes, you killed enemies over and over in previous Souls games as well, but those games didn't waste your time with so much pointless repetitive padding. I remind you why a player would do all of this side content, and that's rewards. So let's talk about those. They suck. Really, they do. I'll make a comparison with Dark Souls 1. In Undead Burg you can find this small house. You enter, get to the balcony, open a chest and find a gold pine resin. This is one of the mini goals that drives your progress through a level, but you realize that only in hindsight. No one told you to come here beforehand. You came to see if there was some interesting loot, and on repeated playthroughs you go in either for completionism or because you specifically want to pick up the resin again. In Elden Ring, side content is very similar. Much like Thor's demon in Undead Burg, your main goal in Elden Ring is clearing whatever legacy dungeon is closest to your power level at the moment. So all the optional side content you do is something you clear either for completion or because you want those rewards. For example, you go into a catacomb, you carefully navigate it so you're not gangbanged by imps. You pull the lever, go back to the entrance, face the boss and get your reward. This is the Elden Ring equivalent of getting that gold pine resin in Undead Burg, with the difference that getting the pine resin is a 5-second detour from the main path. Completing a catacomb instead takes between 15 and 30 minutes on average. Elden Ring is a game that purposefully wastes your time if you're trying to play it like Dark Souls. And it does play like Dark Souls. In these games, you don't need every reward the game has to offer, but clearing a level of loot doesn't significantly extend your playtime, unless you would just rush straight to the boss door otherwise. So you still tend to grab most of the loot in each level. Here in Shulva there is a spell I've never used with any of my characters, right here, yet I always grab it on each of my playthroughs. Because why not? In Elden Ring, you take your time to get a reward by killing a boss or opening a chest somewhere, and in the end it will probably be something you will never need. This is annoying on a first playthrough. On a second, it may still be annoying because you won't remember where all the items are, so you'll have to play with the wiki open. But the problem isn't necessarily that rewards may not be for everyone. The issue is that after playing the game a while, you will reach a point where, upon stumbling on a piece of content, you will ask yourself, is it worth it? Should I waste my time for a meaningless reward, or is there really something interesting in there? And you don't know the answer in advance, so you are effectively gambling whenever you do side content in the open world. You're gambling on whether or not your time spent doing that content will be properly rewarded. More often than not, it won't be. So the mediocre or repetitive quality of what you've just experienced will be even more pronounced because of the lack of satisfaction. I think a possible solution for this problem would have been to give the player an expectation of what kind of rewards they'll get. The game already does this with Churches of America. You know you'll likely find a flask upgrade in them. Also, most mage towers hold either memory stones or spells. To follow those examples, catacombs could have always yielded you a new Ash of War or a new weapon. Obviously, this design idea would need to be coupled with sensible content placement and pacing. I think the more time-wasting pieces of side content should have given the player multiple different rewards, or alternatively, they could have given the player more universally useful ones that any player can appreciate, regardless of build. That's how legacy dungeons are designed, because they're classic Souls levels. You find a lot of cool stuff in those, so most players and builds will make use of at least some of the loot. By condensing the more superfluous pieces of side content, as suggested earlier, you could employ a similar philosophy, instead of having every catacomb end with one boss fight that gives you one reward, and maybe one chest with another one. As another example, let's look at the many tiers of smithing stones featured in the game. They are limited loot within mines. To buy them infinitely you need to find bell bearings. Some of these are obtained by killing a boss at the end of a mine, but not all. If they'd made less mines, each more individually fleshed out, and always gave you a smithing stone bell bearing at the end, the player would feel encouraged to find and clear each of these dungeons. In the game as it is, you are still tempted to look for mines, but simply because upgrade stones are very limited, and you can usually get a decent guaranteed amount from fixed spawn points within the mines themselves, but often you'll just be looting smithing stones you don't necessarily need right now. It rarely feels like a proper reward for you taking the time to clear these dungeons. With my proposed method, both the mines and upgrade system would have immediately benefited in terms of experience quality. The game does technically always provide a generic reward that's useful for everyone. I'm talking about runes. Issue being, rune rewards suck. This wasn't an accident, it was a conscious design decision to prevent players from just grinding too easily. Outside of a couple of farming spots, it's only the endgame that adequately rewards you with enough runes to consistently level up fast, mainly by defeating bosses. This band-aid solution was a consequence of copy and pasting the source formula in a world that's way too big. In the older games, having enemies respawn in the same places every time you rested or died was also a conscious design decision. If you were bad at the game and were repeating the same area over and over, you could eventually just earn enough currency to make your life easier, one way or another. But you never had to farm, unless you wanted a rare enemy drop. In Elden Ring, by not changing anything from Dark Souls 3, the devs were afraid that players would just overlevel everything, by virtue of killing all the enemies they populated the world and dungeons with. And they also didn't want players who only focused on the main content to feel underleveled. Replayability would have greatly suffered if all this side content had more influence on character strength. But making rune rewards solo was an inelegant solution, because now a lot of the content to clear feels worthless, unless it yields you something specifically useful or interesting for your build. And when that doesn't happen, it feels even more frustrating because of how big and padded the game is. Anyway, it's the many enemies in the game that drop runes. And almost everything in this game is an enemy. And this isn't a Shadow of the Colossus style barren world. The enemies are everywhere. And at first you might want to kill them, thinking that by virtue of this being a Souls game, you'll be properly rewarded with runes. Or maybe you just want to experience the combat, because that's everything the game has to offer really. But after a while it just gets exhausting. Running past enemies and picking up the important loot is the preferable option after the halfway point. Why fill the world with so many meaningless enemy encounters? There are cool enemy interactions every once in a while, but they are the rare exception, not the rule. The game did not need to be this dense of enemies, especially once you consider that from the plateau onwards, you will basically stop seeing new enemy types, and everything becomes copy-pasted. And fighting these enemies also becomes a chore in terms of combat, because of the damage and health bloat. But that's another issue. And speaking of the many enemies in the overworld, most of them will be guarding items of some kind, or they may drop items themselves. What's the most of the loot you find out in the open? Crafting materials, or golden runes. Sometimes both. Thrilling. So what's crafting for? To create buffs, healing wares, throwable items and ammo. Mostly items that already existed in past Souls games, as stuff you'd find in the levels, normally, or buy. Wouldn't it have been better maybe, just maybe, to fill out the massive world with, usable items? Instead of giving you the materials to craft fire grease or bone darts, why not give you these items directly? So those who take their time to explore and loot everything would have been rewarded with a massive supply of shit they'd actually be tempted to use. As it is, players need first to find the recipe, remember to craft the item, make sure they have the appropriate materials, go farm if they don't, and lastly remember that they can use it in a certain dangerous situation. By filling out the world with usable items, only the last step would have been needed. And since players would have so much of that stuff organically, they'd be more inclined to use it. In past Souls games, I rarely felt like I needed stuff like pen resins or bombs outside of very specific interactions. It's a simple issue really. If I need the item to have an easier time, I lose it upon usage, so if I use it a few times I will probably run out. If I have a steady supply, it means I'm probably good enough at the game that I don't need that sort of stuff anyway. This was a limitation of the level design and death system in those games. Elden Ring, being open world, was less limited in this regard. By giving the player 100 firebombs, he's going to use them eventually. Instead, I think in my entire 100 hours playthrough, I used throwable pots maybe 3 times at most. The game also includes the sleep ailment, which is a very cool concept and it's very useful against some enemies. But why bother with limited sleep pots and sleep arrows, when by the time I can craft them I've already managed without them? If the game had started giving me a steady supply from the very start, I might have included these items in my playstyle more. And yes, you could say all the content is optional. It's hidden away at the edges of the map, so only insane players with OCD would actually bother to clear it. I can see that it's somehow my fault for trying to play Dark Souls 4 like I played the others. But even accepting that, let's dig deeper. You know what Elden Ring's open world reminds me of? That's right, Todd Howard's masterpiece itself, Skyrim. The similarities are obvious when it comes to visuals, atmosphere and mythological or historical inspirations, but these are all rather superficial traits. Now, I'm not saying these two games have the same open world design, but they feel similar to some extent. And that's the interesting thing, because I really like the open world design of Skyrim, while the one in Elden Ring has disappointed me. In Skyrim, you have hundreds of optional dungeons that generally repeat the same visual and gameplay ideas, and may or may not yield a useful reward, usually alongside a boss fight at the end. The same can be said about Elden Ring. But in Skyrim, doing this doesn't feel like a waste of time, even if what you get at the end isn't that useful to you as a player. Why is that? Two reasons, I believe. The first is a mechanical one. Skyrim has a more meaningful looting system. Most objects are interactable and function as an inventory, and most inventories will yield some gold, items you can sell for gold or other useful stuff. Hoarding gold in Skyrim is generally more satisfying than obtaining runes in Elden Ring, since it's a more long-term reward. The way experience works is also very important, because in Skyrim every interaction with the enemies and NPCs is an opportunity for your character to improve their skills. In Elden Ring this only happens with runes acting as XP and upgrade materials, and I've already explained how poorly balanced those two aspects are. But this is all very subjective. Some players will rather always get runes from killing enemies, instead than having to look for gold and gems in every pot and corpse. But the second reason is, I believe, the most important one. In Skyrim you have a compass that telegraphs all nearby dungeons. If you want, you can go explore and clear them. But after playing a while, you'll notice that following quests is preferable, because most of them will eventually lead to the exploration of a dungeon anyway. There are some more isolated ones with no quests attached, or whose quest only starts once you decide to engage with the content, but the overall experience is pretty well balanced. What that means is that even if a dungeon has pointless reward mechanically, at the very least you always have some other reason to do it, and you are always encouraged to do so because you are properly guided. Obviously, this depends on how invested a player will be in the story, world and characters, and Skyrim doesn't excel at all in its writing. But I hope you can see why this system works and why Skyrim was so addicting for many. The fundamental experience of being guided by characters and notes towards the bulk of the side content is far more interesting than the checklist approach of Ubisoft-style open worlds, despite both systems, at the end of the day, being about simply following a UI marker. Elden Ring follows neither of these two designs. There is no checklist to give you a dopamine rush for clearing it, and you aren't organically guided towards the content by the narrative component. So what does Elden Ring do exactly? Elden Ring instead opts for what would be the preferable open world design option, that of pure exploration. You find and do stuff because you simply do. Content is mostly hidden or not telegraphed that much. You are sometimes given direction, but it's not as obvious as a marker on your map. This is amazing in theory. But we made it full circle to what I said earlier. Yes, exploring for the sake of exploring is incredibly fun, at first, but it simply stops working after a certain point. And it stops working because of all the issues I've discussed so far. The content in the open world simply isn't varied, meaningful, or rewarding enough to warrant this approach. If the game was, like I suggested earlier in a way, more similar to Shadow of the Colossus, meaning a huge barren wasteland connecting the various legacy dungeons, I think it would have been better for it. Vertical navigation with torrent could have been used to cross a ravine or valley to reach a castle, or to find a way to get past a broken bridge. Then you could have had smaller secrets scattered on the map, an enemy guarding a treasure here, an abandoned church there, and so on. I think this would have worked far better with the formula they copy-pasted from previous Souls games, and also would have fit more with the atmosphere of decay and desolation they were going for. As it is, the open world is way too dense and way too empty at the same time. Everything is lifeless and hostile, but nothing about the design itself supports this artistic decision. Traversing Mistwood, which is populated by giant dangerous bears, would have been an amazing, unique experience in a game like Shadow of the Colossus, but in Elden Ring every part of the world is already out there to kill you, so it doesn't stand out. This connects to the stupid choice of having the hub, once again, separated from the rest of the world. This game was the perfect opportunity to give us a proper sequel to Majula, a village that acts as your main hub, from which all the other explorable routes would pan out. As you'd find NPCs in the map, they would come back to the village, making it more lively and meaningful. A Majula-inspired hub would have been a great choice, especially considering the amount of stuff already in Elden Ring that was inspired by Dark Souls 2. I've mentioned the barren wasteland approach, but I also want to propose another world design philosophy that could work. This connects to what I've said before about Skyrim questing system, so I'll call it the Skyrim approach. This is closer to what Elden Ring already is, a dense, huge world full of side content and stuff to do. In this approach, Elden Ring would take one additional clue from Skyrim, that being quests and narratives driving more of the exploration. The game already kind of does this sometimes. Most people have expressed their fondness for Ranni's questline, for example, and this is the only major element of the game that works like what I'm suggesting. It's a narrative involving multiple characters and choices that will bring you to different places and dungeons within the open world. You can start it in a bunch of different ways through different NPCs in different places, but you at least need to clear Caria Manor to meet Ranni herself. At this point she'll give you a quest that you need to do alongside Blythe. You'll find him underground in Shofra River. If you haven't explored the area yet, you'll receive a clue on how to find it. Then after meeting Blythe there, you need to go back to Seluvis, who tells you to go find Sellen in Limgrave, and it keeps going like that. This questline is probably one of the best things in the game, and it follows the Skyrim approach. The characters and the story drive your exploration and give you goals. For example, if you hadn't found Sellen before this point, you'd now have to go defeat Pumpkinhead at the Waypoint Ruins. You may not give a shit about the helmet he gives you as a reward, but it doesn't matter, because you went there with a goal in mind, and fulfilling it is the real reward, not just the item you get from killing a boss. I think Elden Ring needed more questlines driving the player across the world. A poor example of this is Gurranq. He gives you a quest to bring him Deathroot, and gives you an item that warns if Death Truth is in the vicinity. The issue is, by the time you stumble upon content that will reward you with the item, you'll probably have already decided to engage with it. So a good rank doesn't drive your exploration unless you go and check the wiki to see where Death Truths are beforehand. And that's the thing with the Skyrim approach. The game as it is doesn't properly support it, because it follows the classic Souls formula way too close, even in the narrative component. Questlines are too vague, sparse, and directionless. This is one of the major complaints people in general have about the game, so I don't think I need to elaborate too much on it. Even Ranni's questline, despite the praise, is often criticized because of this issue. If the game had dropped the pretenses of being Dark Souls 4, where everything is dead and NPCs are vague and unhelpful, the world design could have been adjusted to benefit from that. This would have also meant having more villages and non-hostile places scattered around the world to break up the constant monotony of fighting. Instead, if they wanted to maintain the same atmosphere as Dark Souls, they should have gone with the Shadow of the Colossus approach I presented earlier. Or at least that's my opinion. You may think Elden Ring's open world is great, and I can see why. I want to add how stupid it is that, despite the size of the map, so many weapons and armor still need to be farmed from enemies. These should have been end-placed rewards scattered in the field and dungeons. There is no excuse for this bullshit, this isn't Monster Hunter. Moving on, for an hypothetical Elden Ring 2, I have a few ideas on how they could provide a more meaningful open world experience. For starters, get rid of the classic XP system, and remove corpse running as well, at least outside of dungeons. Instead, you should have a more long-term form of currency, like how gold works in most video games. It can still be souls, runes, or an equivalent, but it will be used to perform transactions and interact with the world. To power up your character, they should do something different. The system featuring stats you banally increase is outdated, and the weapon upgrade system is overly restrictive, considering how new weapons are some of the most common rewards. You could still have stats, but you'd increase them in a similar way to memory slots. To get more health, you'd need to find more health orbs, or whatever. To increase your strength, you'd need to find strength runes, and so on. These power-ups would provide flat, noticeable bonuses, but on top of them I'd like to propose a skill system of sorts. The game already features Ashes of War, so why not incorporate them into a proper progression system, similar to what Sekiro had. You could still find some of them as rewards for defeating bosses and enemies, but maybe you could also find skill points scattered around the world, and use them to unlock whatever you want, giving the player more meaningful rewards that actually alter or influence the way you approach the content is necessary. For example, the physic flask is a great idea, but the execution is somewhat limited, because you only get one sip and there are options that are simply more generally useful than others. Outside of very sporadic scenarios, you have very little reason to not have the shield effect, the health regen or the free FP casting at all times. Another necessity would be to make stealth and sleep more interesting options, and to add new ways for the player to interact with the world besides just depleting nameless health bars. Why are bewitching branches craftable items you need to use in melee? Why are spirit summons only usable in specific areas, and why do they function as an offline equivalent of phantoms? These things should have been build options in my opinion. For example, as a druid class, you would gain access to wolf summons, eagle summons, and so on. And you may use spells or skills that allow you to pacify animals around you, and maybe make them temporary allies. Maybe enemies like the ancestral followers can become allied to you if you wear their armor, or if you complete a specific questline, or if you use some buffs or spells or whatever. You know, just fill the world with cool and unique interactions, so that the feeling of repetition is mitigated, without actually needing to create new assets. Moving on, making dungeon exploration more important to world navigation and narrative is another thing that should be addressed. This way you could have an NPC tell you that you can enter a castle from a catacomb or tunnel underground, or stuff like that. Elden Ring already does this with the ravine section in Liurnia, which is one of my favorite moments in the game. That's the sort of carefully crafted content that enhances the open world experience, and the sequel needs more of those. I think the dual S2 system from DS3 doesn't work that well in an open world. I'd go back to something like what they proposed for Dark Souls 2, S2s and limited life gems for health. For magic, I think having focus points slowly regenerate on their own, with items you can use to speed up the regen, is a more interesting approach. Because why would I waste potential healing charges to defeat normal enemies, when sword swings are unlimited? Alternatively, they could go back to spell uses that can be restored with items. This would make magic easier to balance, since every spell could stand on its own, and wouldn't need to draw from a single source. With the current mana system, because of how limited it is, players are funneled into either class cannons playstyles or into spamming the most cost-effective spells over and over. Obviously, this is partly the consequence of challenge being the main design focus behind the combat system, rather than fun, but we'll get to that soon. When it comes to crafting, what I said before about looting still applies. Outside of that, crafting could become its own branch of the gameplay, kinda like how in Skyrim you can create new weapons and armor, improve them, or craft potions and enchant weapons. From Software could turn the physic flask into an actual alchemy system of sorts, with different refillable and customizable flasks. Infusions have taken a step backwards from previous games, by becoming banal menu options you choose to maximize your stat scaling. There should be a proper system to engrave runes into weapons and customize them. When it comes to the weapon upgrade system, abandon that plus 25 shit. I'd suggest something closer to Dragon's Dogma, where you need specific ores and materials taken from enemies and monsters to improve your weapon by one tier. This could work in tandem with my tunnels and mines suggestion. Maybe there is an NPC that belongs to a race of miners or cave dwellers, and you could send him to perform expeditions into the mines and tunnels you've already cleared. This could provide you with a steady supply of ores you can use. This is far more interesting than simply buying everything for runes from a vendor who doesn't even talk or move. I know these may seem all random and half-cooked ideas, because they are, but they are also options and opportunities to fill out the world. Now, let's talk about what Elden Ring has to offer outside of the open world itself. Because of the repetitive and unfulfilling nature of the open world, Elden Ring comes across as a collection of dungeons. The smaller ones have sometimes interesting ideas and gameplay gimmicks, but the majority of them are pretty bland. So what about legacy dungeons? Honestly, they're also a bit of a mixed bag. I think they fall a bit in the same trap as DS3, where they don't feel distinct enough between each other, or even relative to the general game experience. Because, again, Elden Ring is just a game of combat. That's all you do besides some puzzles and platforming. You combat enemies in the open world, and the legacy dungeons are, once again, mostly just that, combat. Some of them have great layouts, but as I've explained ad nauseam, a good and complex layout isn't enough to make a level good. I still think most of the legacy dungeons are good to some extent, but they aren't distinct enough in terms of gameplay. The hero graves and some of the caves and catacombs feature the most interesting level design ideas in the game, and they are all missable and optional. The legacy dungeons are really good Dark Souls 3 or Bloodborne levels, but I've already played those games. Raya Lucaria and Caria Manor are the legacy areas that feel the most distinct in terms of gameplay, even if their layouts isn't as interesting as that of Stormveil Castle, for example. Volcano Manor is also pretty cool because of the lava and platforming, but that's it. I like it, but you aren't doing or seeing much that you haven't done and seen already. Leyndell is impressive because of how dispersive it can be, and the same can be said about its sewers. but the gameplay and enemies aren't distinct enough for me. I guess the sewers have at least some platforming and confusing labyrinths to spice things up. It's definitely one of my favorite areas in the game. The Allig tree starts with potential derived from its unusual layout and structure, but the initial section is very short and the enemies and their placement are infuriating. The level slightly improves later on, but it ends very quickly. The city after it is just a clusterfuck of random enemies with no interesting gameplay to speak of. I'm very fond of Nokron and Noxtella, and I like Castleborn as well. Shaded, Sol and Redmane Castle are all pretty bad instead. You've played these levels before. There is not much value for someone familiar with the franchise. I can't expect From Software to reinvent itself with each entry, but I think even something closer to the style of Dark Souls 2 or Sekiro, with more condensed, faster paced levels that have some interesting mechanical gimmick, would have been preferable. In Elden Ring all you do is combat, over and over again. So is the combat good and varied enough to carry a 100 hours experience? No, Elden Ring doesn't have a strong enough combat system to carry the level and world design. And vice versa, the latter two aren't able to keep the combat interesting or fresh either. In the first few hours of the game, I thought From Software had gotten it mostly right. Now, the baggage inherited from Dark Souls 3 was still there. The game controls and feels the same. There is input delay on dodging, and spammable rolls with many iframes are still the main defensive option at your disposal. But there were a few changes and caveats that made me feel like the game was a noticeable improvement over its predecessor. First, guard countering. It's a rather fun mechanic that gives more offensive option to defensive playstyles. It encourages using shields and rewards having decent timing. Guard countering an attack is infinitely more satisfying than iframing through it. I'm not a fan that they buffed weapon blocking only with the most recent patches though. It should have been more useful by default. Inherited from Sekiro is a half-baked version of the posture system. Heavy, counter and jump attacks break the enemy's posture much more easily compared to light attacks. So, unlike Dark Souls 3, which was an R1 game, here you are encouraged to use your moveset to its fullest. Breaking an enemy's posture is also very satisfying to pull off. The game also fixed the R1 spam problem by giving R1 combo chains to every weapon. But all these tweaks to the combat are meaningless if the enemies aren't fun to fight. And at first I thought they were. It seemed From Software actually took clues from Dark Souls 2 and focused more on challenging encounter design that rewards crowd control, rather than making enemies that are individually strong. With the addition of Torrent, Spirit Summons, Ashes of War, and the higher variety of spells, fighting against multiple enemies is very fun in Elden Ring, for a while at least. These encounters is where the combat system shines because you are encouraged and required to use all your tools, to strategize and to have good positioning, something that was made largely irrelevant in Dark Souls 3. Some of the best combat moments of Elden Ring reminded me a lot of Dark Souls 2, and since I like Dark Souls 2 I'm happy for that. Some people have instead complained about this. They hate the ganks the game throws at you, and blame Dark Souls 2 and Tanimura for that. To be fair, I really started disliking the ganks as well, in the second half of the game. The issue is that a unique, ganky enemy encounter is only fun if the individual enemies are properly tuned for that, and Elden Ring doesn't bother with it. The problem runs way deeper than the bloated health pools and damage values in the endgame, which are legitimate flaws, mind you. But Elden Ring's biggest issue, at least when it comes to combat, is that individual enemies aren't fun to fight. I'll back up my claim later, but right now I want to play devil's advocate a bit. Let's assume all Dark Souls 2 inspired game design decisions came from Tanimura, and everything else was Miyazaki's doing. This is a wild and baseless assumption. That's probably not how the design and development process at From Software works. It's possible that Tanimura, being a co-director, didn't handle specific encounters that much and simply approved the work of others. We don't know how these other designers factored in the overall creative process. Looking at the credits, it seems the major designers worked more with Miyazaki in his games and had little to do with Dark Souls 2. In any case, let's continue with the assumption above, simply for clarity. So, Tanimura, let's say, filled the DS2 with gangs and encounters against multiple enemies, not because he's insane or is an asshole that hates players, but because he understood that the simplistic combat mechanics worked best with this design approach, as long as the intent is to maintain a varied and consistent level of challenge. If the encounter design was too banal, the game may have felt too easy and too samey, which is in my opinion one of the biggest issues in DS3. The latter compensated by having more complex and dangerous enemies, although most of them could be safely countered by spamming rolls and light attacks. So if Tanimura decided to reincorporate the Dark Souls 2 design philosophy for Elden Ring, I believe it was the right call. After all, there are some genuinely interesting and fun combat encounters, both in the open world and in the dungeons. But considering the size of the game, Tanimura couldn't possibly maintain a consistent level of quality across every dungeon and every spot on the map. And it also wasn't his goal in the first place to design, animate and balance all these enemies. So he had two options. Either he filled the world with boring and uninteresting encounters because the enemies were already challenging enough individually, or he'd risk making some of them feel a tad too unbalanced and unfair, but at least provide a meaningful experience that encourages players to use all their tools. I believe going with the second route was a sensible decision on the part of Tanimura, or whatever group of people was tasked with encounter design. It didn't always pan out, and some encounters were definitely made bullshit for the sake of it, but there is nothing in the game that's ever impossible if you're willing to use everything at your disposal. But why do I think the encounter designers didn't have a say in how the enemies were tuned? Well, I believe this was a result of too many creative minds working on an overly ambitious game. Bloodborne, Dark Souls 3 and Sekiro suggest that Miyazaki, or someone else on his team, really likes a certain type of enemy design, and if then Miyazaki had tasked Tanimura, or someone else, to handle encounter and level design, this person probably wasn't able to give us back the slower and more deliberate enemies in the style of the older titles. So I believe this dissonance caused the overall unbalanced enemy gangs or multi-enemy boss fights that exist in this game. But this just shows, at least to me, the limitations of the Dark Souls formula. Disregarding Kingsfield, of which I have no knowledge about, the formula was created by Miyazaki to handle slower and more deliberate enemies, enemies with easier to read animations, short combos and manageable reach. Dark Souls 2 understood this very well, and created its encounters with those limitations in mind. Then, when the team decided to make Bloodborne a fast, more aggressive game, they really should have dropped the formula altogether. I think Bloodborne would have been a far better game if they reinvented the gameplay, instead of copying the one from Dark Souls. I think Bloodborne works, I'm not saying it doesn't, but I also think it's stuck in a pointless limbo, between the slower and methodical Dark Souls and a faster, spammier combat-focused game. And that game is Sekiro. The best title FromSoft has put out in the last decade, in my opinion, is the game Bloodborne should have been in a way. More accurately, I think Bloodborne could have been two games in one. Bloodborne is a horror game, but it also wants to have fast-paced, visceral combat. I think they could have pulled off this combination much better. Imagine if, as a hunter, you were far weaker and more limited in what you could do. Yharnam would have been a dangerous place, where hiding or escaping from enemies was often the desirable option. Playing as a hunter would have been the horror part of the game, but by killing enough enemies and acquiring enough blood, you would have been to unlock, let's say, Beast mode. And then, kind of like a power-up meter in a classic action game, your gameplay would have changed accordingly. Beast mode would have made you stronger, more agile, and it would have opened up more aggressive strategies to deal with the more dangerous enemies and bosses that roam the map. Beast mode would have been the Sekiro before Sekiro. I believe if From Software had designed Bloodborne like this, it would have been a superior game. As it is, it just feels like a faster, more visceral Dark Souls, which isn't saying much. Speaking of, Dark Souls 3 came along. The enemy design was largely the same as Bloodborne, but your character moved and felt closer to the undeads from DS1 or 2, rather than the hunter. So to compensate for the different enemies, the game gave you easily spammable and safe rolls that essentially allowed you to bypass the danger, as long as your timing was correct. Dark Souls 3 is a game of iframe abuse, because everything in it is much more competent and stronger than you. Good positioning or planning are largely irrelevant in that game, as long as you are invulnerable when the enemy does something cool and epic. You are good to go. Once again, this shows the limitations of the system. Dark Souls 3 is fundamentally the same as Dark Souls 2, but with more iframes by default, slightly faster attack animations and less stamina management required. And without taking into consideration whether designing the combat system like this was the right call for a sequel to a series of methodical dungeon crawlers, one has to wonder, shouldn't From Software have reworked the combat from the ground up, so that these more dangerous and aggressive enemies were, actually fun to fight? Because, to me, pressing the roll button at the right time to become invincible isn't that fun. You know what's more fun? Pressing the block button at the right time to deflect attacks. Sekiro, in a way, is still a game of iframe abuse, but why does it succeed where Bloodborne and Dark Souls 3 failed? First of all, Sekiro drops the stamina bar altogether. You can spam every action as much as you want, outside of Spirit Emblem costs, which act like your mana bar. I think the game would have been better if emblems were, an actual mana bar, instead of being limited items you need to farm. In any case, Bloodborne and Dark Souls 3 already made stamina less relevant. In fact, it felt like an unnecessary system in those games at times. You only ever had to pay attention to it if you were using heavy weapons, or if you were trying to block attacks. It was a limiter of the fun you could have, really. So Sekiro simply removed it and added in its place a posture bar that signals how much you can block and how much can an enemy stand its ground before you can deplete itself. This is a great system because it actually rewards proper aggression from the part of the player and punishes passive play. Bloodborne and Dark Souls 3 wanted you to play aggressively with their fast pace, but in those games you were always at the mercy of what the enemies were doing, unless you opened them up for a critical. In Sekiro, being aggressive is what allows you to put them in the same state. When it comes to evasion, Sekiro doesn't have many iframes in its dodge animation, yet it's still a useful tool to get away from attacks, as opposed to iframing through them. That's what a dodge should do after all. Unfortunately, the mechanic has a problem. The tracking of some attacks makes it so you still can't dodge away from things if the game doesn't want you to. In that way, Sekiro is a more limited combat experience, although it isn't necessarily a bad thing. Good positioning isn't always required or useful. It's something you need when the designers expect you to use it. The Mikiri counter skill fills a similar role. It's extremely useful, but only works against thrust attacks. You can also use jumping to avoid and counter sweeping attacks. Grabs, sweeps and thrust are all unblockable and the game warns you of that. A big issue of the Dark Souls games is that whether an attack is unparryable or unblockable is mostly unpredictable. You need to try and fail to find out against each individual enemy. In Sekiro, you can passively block almost every attack as long as you have enough posture to do so. With a timed block, you will instead deflect the attack. This is similar in theory to iframing attacks with your dodge, but in practice the two mechanics are very far apart. In Dark Souls 3, if you mistime your dodge roll and get it outside of iframes, it's the same as getting it while standing still doing nothing. In Sekiro, if you mistime a deflection, you can still block the attack. Thus, trying to learn the specific timings is less frustrating. If you do a charmless run, you are expected to deflect everything, but it's meant for the experienced players for this specific reason. If you've cleared the game before, you already know most of the timings. In a game like Dark Souls 3, you need to either get lucky or get it the first few times to learn them, and it's not nearly as satisfying. Another difference is that deflecting is both a defensive and offensive option. If you roll through an attack in Dark Souls 3, you have no guarantee that you'll be able to counter the enemy. In Sekiro, deflecting always rewards the player by lowering the enemy's posture. Also, counterattacking itself feels different. The tempo, the rhythm, is far more natural and satisfying in Sekiro compared to other From Software games. This is helped immensely by the third difference, which is momentum. When you roll in Dark Souls, your positioning is affected, and you lose whatever momentum you could have built with your offense. This isn't an issue when rolling is simply an evasive maneuver, like in Dark Souls 2, but it becomes one when you design the combat like a rhythm game. Sekiro is designed like that, and arguably Dark Souls 3 is as well. But deflecting as your main defensive option instead of rolling simply feels better to use and handle. All these changes greatly open up the way you design enemies. In Dark Souls 3 they made the rolls easily spammable, so to counter that they added delayed attacks and tracking to punish not properly timing them. Because of all the reasons we've discussed, these tricks aren't nearly as annoying to deal with in Sekiro. The same can be said about endless combos. Rolling through a flurry in Dark Souls feels messy, almost like the game isn't functioning properly and you shouldn't be doing that. In Sekiro you are expected to deflect multiple attacks in a row, with a specific rhythm, and it just feels right. I know talking about feeling isn't ideal when discussing combat design, but I'm sure you can understand what I'm trying to express, if you have played these games too. Let's go back to Elden Ring now. In what way is its enemy design overtuned, as I suggested earlier? Well, Elden Ring essentially cranks the flaws with the design from Dark Souls 3 up to 11, to the point that, arguably, some enemies and bosses end up feeling like they were meant for Sekiro's combat system. I believe from now on I can talk about strong enemies and bosses interchangeably, because that's kind of how Elden Ring works. Is the Crucible Knight an enemy or a boss? What about the ulcerated tree spirit? The game reuses bosses and mini-bosses so much that the distinction isn't meaningful. Anyway, what are those flaws of the enemy design? For starters, let's see what it did right. Those instant opening animations that were so common in Bloodborne and Dark Souls 3, they are still here, but overall I say they are not nearly as frequent. And I guess my praises end here. For example, even if less present, this issue is probably worse than before when it pops up. In Dark Souls 3, instant attacks were generally low damaging melee strikes. Osero's charge was the worst example in that game, but at least it could still be blocked. Elden Ring instead gives most of its bosses AoEs, and some of them feel way too fast if you're close to the source of damage. You'd think this could reward a good positioning, but if you're playing as a melee character then you don't have much choice. You will end up in range of those extremely quick AoEs. If you react fast enough and don't get hit, which is often easier said than done, you can either iframe through these or jump over them. Jumping doesn't have iframes but shrinks your hitbox instead, and thus feels a bit inconsistent. The game takes a step backwards from Sekiro, and doesn't properly telegraph attacks that you can jump over. Once again you need to try and fail to find out. And iframing always works, so why would a player risk jumping when they have the safer alternative right there? Another step backwards is the lack of a posture bar. You can't see how close an enemy is to be stance broken, so if you're using a weapon that doesn't deal that much DPS to health, you are encouraged to spam stance breaking attacks until you get it, and that means in turn spamming jumping attacks over and over, because enemies are faster and with lower recoveries than ever, and jumping equalizes attack timings for all weapon classes, regardless of weight. So you get an easy, safe attack that also deals a lot of posture damage. Unless you're using certain weapon types, jumping attacks are simply the best choice against most bosses, although I believe these may have changed with the latest patch, since they supposedly shorten recovery times for heavier weapons on normal attacks. But what do I mean by enemies being faster than ever with lower recoveries? In Dark Souls 3, bosses had fairly consistent openings. They weren't that long, but you were confident in the windows they gave you for counter-attacking, after experiencing those attacks and moves enough times. In Elden Ring, you don't have this confidence. Bosses can simply jump away, continue their combo, or start a new one whenever they want. Sometimes they'll behave extremely passively unless you actually try to attack them, or try to heal. In Dark Souls 2, Fume Knight punished healing outside of an opening, and could extend his combos to catch you off guard. This worked because he was a slow boss in a slow-paced game. In Elden Ring, most bosses have the same behavior as Fume Knight, but are way faster and can straight up cancel their recovery animations to make things even worse. Combat now feels more luck-based. It's not even a matter of dodging through attacks and punishing accordingly like in Dark Souls 3. You need to get good RNG and hope you can punish the bosses. This issue becomes extremely blatant with enemies that have a frame 0 input rating heal punish, which feels borderline comical if you abuse it, like with the Goldskin duo. These issues also make guard countering a generally useless option against most bosses, since those enemies can just jump away or start an attack during your counter animation. And much like past Dark Souls games, most bosses can't be staggered or interrupted during their attacks. Unless you manage to break their posture or have enough poise to tank one hit, you need to avoid what they have to throw at you to survive. And once again, that means iframing at the right time. So, we get back to iframes. It seems From Software listened to complaints about Dark Souls 3 and nerfed the rolls. Only they buffed the enemies as well. So you have enemies that feel like they are meant for rolls even stronger than those of DS3, but instead they are now weaker. The input delay issue still hasn't been fixed, and this is just pure indefensible bullshit. The way rolls were nerfed also adds insult to injury. There are 4 aspects to a Dark Souls roll: distance covered, recovery period, invulnerability period, and stamina cost. Elden Ring only nerfed the first 2 elements. What that means is that rolls have been cemented as the iframe at the right time button. In Dark Souls 3 you could still survive by rolling away from attacks, even if you mistimed the iframes, because of how much distance they covered and how spammable they were. In Elden Ring this isn't nearly as viable anymore. If you fuck up the timing, you are likely getting hit. How does that happen? Through the same measures already implemented in Dark Souls 3. Unnaturally delayed roll catches and excessive tracking. Elden Ring features these 2 tricks even more than the previous game, and coupled with nerfed rolls, it proves the design decisions made for that earlier combat system weren't an accident. Miyazaki and his team deliberately made Dark Souls 3 that way, because, I don't know, they like forcing players to iframe through attacks? Elden Ring basically removes any margin of error that Dark Souls 3 offered. It almost feels like they took personal offense that people who were tricked by the delayed wind-ups were still able to not get hit by spamming the roll button again. So for Elden Ring they took that option away. They could have nerfed iframes and stamina costs. This way rolls would have become an evasive maneuver that you needed to perform deliberately. And then they could have designed enemy movesets around these different rolls. But no, they did the opposite. The devs further leaned into the iframe abuse, and overtuned the enemies to ensure players rolled the way they wanted. In Dark Souls 3, some enemies and bosses had telegraphs that looked very similar to a normal attack, but were instead unnaturally delayed just a tiny bit to trick your brain, muscle memory and expectation of what momentum is. It was a shitty design, but at least it was consistent. You learned the different timings, rolled at the right time, and were good to go. Elden Ring, instead, introduces variable delay timings for roll-catching attacks, grabs especially. For example, the grabbing thrust from Cleanrot Knights punishes rolling too early by changing the timing, but the issue is way more insidious than you might think. It makes you second guess everything. Once you learn that bosses and enemies can do this, any mistake on your part will leave you confused. You'll always wonder whether you simply mistimed a dodge or the enemy genuinely changed their telegraph to fuck you over. All reason and satisfaction is removed from combat, simply because the devs want you to iframe at the right time, and want you to get it over and over again until you learn what the right time is. The unnatural delayed animations and excessive tracking prevent you from dodging attacks in a way that makes sense. Nothing in Elden Ring's combat makes sense, and the experience is a lot less satisfying because of it. I have one final issue with rolling, and it's that in Elden Ring, it has fundamentally lost its original purpose. In Dark Souls 1, blocking, rolling and parrying were your main defensive actions, and each had a specific role. Spacing attacks was a general method to avoid damage, but it wasn't relegated to a specific input. Rolling was easy to perform to avoid attacks through positioning, harder if you wanted to iframe, and in general it left you more vulnerable compared to blocking, which was safer and easier to pull off, but limited your counter-offensive options afterwards. Parrying was a high-risk, high-reward mechanic. You needed precise timing, in theory, to leave an enemy open for a powerful critical hit. This meant being able to properly read animations, wait in front of an enemy and pressing the button at the right time. Now, doesn't this description fit the role in Elden Ring? Rolling has now become the new parry, but it doesn't offer the same rewarding counter. Instead, it's treated like blocking was in DS1. It's your safest and most reliable way to avoid damage, without leaving you much room to answer to enemies. So dodging as a mechanic completely lost its place and role in the formula, which, keep in mind, hasn't changed all that much from Demon Souls. And this happened solely because the devs wanted bosses to be fast, cool and imposing all at the same time. But was the trade-off worth it?